Hello, today I am focusing on lots and lots of stamping tools. I will show you a variety of them, talk pros and cons, and tips and tricks. I will show you a little bit of what these tools can do. I'm going to focus on my favorite tool and why, and then I have a bonus at the end using very specific stamp product. Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty, where I create with paper and photos in artful ways. Okay, we can't talk about stamping without talking about paper, and especially for scrapbookers. Typical scrapbook paper will have texture on one side, but the other side should be smooth. You can also purchase specifically smooth cardstock. As you can see here, if you try to stamp on a textured side, even on the back side, sometimes that texture will show through. And when you stamp on a smooth paper, you're going to get better results. But there are also lots of tools available to help you get better results, and that's the topic of today. All right, we are going to start off with the simplest of ideas, and that is to reuse some kind of foam packaging to create a cushion under your stamping. If your stamp can squish down into something, it's going to help make better contact between the paper and the ink on the stamp for better results. This particular cushion you can buy. It's from the Stamps of Life, and I will put links to everything I talk about down below if any of these one particular products interest you. This was a reused old mouse pad. I use it for poking holes, but you can use it for this purpose of stamping. Another tip when you're stamping is to lay your stamp upside down and ink onto the surface. Especially with modern clear stamps, they tend to be sticky, and so they might stick to your ink pads. All right, here I am just doing basic stamping, and as a reminder, you don't want to rock your stamp back and forth. You just want to kind of put even pressure down on your stamp and then lift it up in a smooth motion so it doesn't tip and press back onto the paper and cause smudges. So that was the final look at stamping on a smooth cardstock, and I am making little notes here as we go to remind which tool I used and see which method works best. This tool is an old school tool. It's been on the market for a very long time, before the Misti came out on the market. And if you have ever done any stamping, you've probably heard of the Misti. Hopefully you understand basic concepts of stamping, but there are other tools related to this particular tool, which is called the Stamp-a-ma-jig. I'm showing some up on the screen. I will put links down below. These tools all kind of work in the same way, and that is to take your stamp block and tuck it right up into the corner of the tool. And when you do that and press down, you will get a stamp there. And if it doesn't come out perfectly, you can re-stamp over the top of it and try and get crisper images. Now, did you just see me bump that tool with my finger? That is the problem with this particular tool. You have to make sure it stays put in order for it to work. But as you can see, that stamped image looks way better than any of the other images I've done before. More solid stamps, bigger stamps, all have a harder time stamping, so having some sort of stamping tool is going to be helpful if you envision doing stamping on projects. Okay, the other part of this tool is this plastic sheet. You can stamp on top of this plastic sheet, and that will show you exactly where your stamp will be. You put the sheet down, line your tool up with the corner of the sheet, and now wherever your stamp block is will line up where you see what you stamped on that sheet. And what's nice about these sheets is that most ink, if you're not using a permanent style ink, will just wipe right off these sheets, and you can reuse this template as many times as you need. Now, another challenge with this tool is that it works best if it's on your layout, because you can put the pressure on the layout so your paper doesn't shift around. So looking at these two images again, the one on the right is where I'm pointing and I had my tool straight on the paper and I kept everything in alignment. And the one on the bottom left over there was where my tool was off the paper, and you could see that it got a little bit blurred when I did that second layer of stamping because something had shifted. Okay, that stamp isn't the best example because it does have some distressedness to the image, especially on the letters. So let's try a different stamp. Now, the other thing with some of these stamp tools is that some stamps are just too big to be practical. In order to use this next stamp, I have to use this giant stamp block, and it is really heavy. However, this particular stamping tool is very affordable, especially compared to some of the other tools we're going to talk about. And no matter how big your stamp is, it can still help you get things aligned. And that's especially important for scrapbookers because we have more space to add more elements, which means we're going to want to help those elements connect with each other, especially like if you're doing borders. Speaking of borders, if your stamp does not have a particular direction to it, you can use a little piece of tape to kind of keep track of which way your stamp is upright so that you keep your alignment exactly where it needs to be. And here you can see it did a pretty good job. All right, that was the tool I used before these stamping platforms became popular, kind of starting with the Misti set off the popularity contest of lots of different manufacturers stamping. And that's because you could put your paper into the Misti, put your stamp anywhere you wanted. It has a grid to help you realign it. The door is much less heavy than some of those stamp blocks. You can use these old-fashioned rubber stamps if you take out the inner pad, and notice that inner pad is cushioned like we talked about at the very beginning of the video. But you don't need that with a rubber stamp because they have a built-in cushion to them. If you have stamps on old wood blocks, you can even microwave them for a few seconds and peel it off the wood block and use those in these platforms. The other benefit to this platform is that it is magnetic, and I'll talk a little bit more about the magnets later because they have pros and cons as well, but they help your paper stay in place no matter how you place it into your block, and that allows you to take your image and do that double stamping process that we talked about so that you can get crisper or clean up any images that were imperfect. You can buy third-party tools that help put pressure onto the stamp, and that can help save your wrists if you have wrist problems. So these platforms are widely used by a lot of people who either had problems with getting nice crisp stamping to begin with or who have kind of wrist problems. These make great solutions to all of that. So here you can see I stamped a total of 3 times on this image, and it looks pretty good despite it being a distressed style, but don't worry, we will use other styles of stamps. Now we've talked pros and cons a little bit already, but I want to focus on the cons if you're a scrapbooker and you want to add stamping to your scrapbooking world. There is a 12x12 Misti, however, it still has some limitations. For example, this is intended for you to butt up into the corner to keep things aligned. However, as you noticed, if you're trying to stamp in a certain position, you'll need to place your paper not necessarily in the corner, which can open you up to things shifting on you, even if you have those magnets. And if you have this large paper and you have the large Misti, if you want to stamp off the corner or the edge of your paper, you're still going to have to move that paper in order to make this tool work. And some specific techniques like this repeat stamping that you see me doing here really does work best if you go off the edge of the paper. All right, finally, coming back to those magnets, I have a couple of different brands. These were the originals that came with my Misti. They are different now, but if they get stuck together, then they are hard to peel apart. So I've added some washi tape and packing tape to make little handles. You also have to be really careful when you set these aside somewhere. My Misti doesn't have a place to store them. Newer Mistis do, because if you set them down and they're too close to each other, they are going to stick together, and that can cause damage to the magnets. I have broken magnets, and they can cause pinching to your fingers. I have hurt myself, so be careful. Let's turn to the stamping platform that I am currently using for my scrapbooking. I still use my Misti for card making just because it's smaller and I know how to use it better, but this may replace even my Misti at some point. Now, it does have some pros and cons of its own, so we will talk about that. This is called the Sizzix Stamp and Stencil Tool, and it does have stenciling capabilities, which we will cover a little bit later, but what I love about it is that it's open on 3 sides, which means I can fit larger papers in here. Do they fit perfectly? No, and we'll talk about some of that. So this has a sticky platform to it instead of a magnetic platform. That does help hold your papers down so they don't get bumped and moved around. I haven't actually bumped my paper off of the sticky, even though it's a pretty low-tack sticky. There are other problems with that sticky, which we will get to, but you put your stamp in place, you close your lid, it picks up your stamp, just like the Misti stamping tool already does. The additional benefit of this one is that you can remove the lid, and that helps it get it closer to you for doing all of these actions like inking it up. It can be awkward on the Misti because the lid is still attached to do that job. Now, this has a cushion built into the underside of the platform, so I think that helps with all the stamping process. It's hard to tell based on how it's designed if that is true or not, but I think that's why that is there. It also is anti-slip for helping keep things in place. Now, because you can take that lid off, you can also use it to replace those big heavy blocks. So that is an additional benefit. When you do store this, you should keep this cover sheet that comes with the tool. That helps protect the sticky from getting de-stickied with lots of dust and lint and, like me, pet hair. Go ahead and put the original lid back on, and we will talk about that extra lid piece that I just took off there in a little bit, because that is a big thing that attracted me to this tool. At any rate, I then just slide these pieces on a shelf for storing them. One of the things I really like about this tool is that I can stamp on the center of my page. I do have to add some markings to my paper to help line it up with that grid that's down below, and lining it up with that grid is not perfect either because it is not 12 inches wide, so you have to use a ruler to help you figure that out. I'm going to make large marks on this. In person, I would make small marks, but I want you to see it on the camera. So once I have that on there, I can get it lined up with the paper. We'll show that a little bit more later. And then to get my stamp lined up on the center, the top platform has a grid also that helps all of those pieces come together. In that case, I just count grid lines to make sure it's centered. All right, this stamping that I'm doing, I will create a project in March, so I hope you come back for that project. But let's keep going with just the platform information for now. Let's move on to some of the other uses I hinted at earlier. Because this is sticky and the lid is removable, you can use it as a platform for assisting with things like ink blending. And I can almost do this one-handed. I have to apply very light pressure to the tool to keep it from slipping and sliding on me, but it makes a great tool for ink blending. It is also a stencil tool. Now, it's intended to be used with its own stencil products and other pieces. I won't be using it that way, but because of the sticky nature, if you line up the stencil that it's overlapping your paper enough, here it is not overlapping enough, it will hold it in place for you as you work on stenciling. Okay, I've covered most of the things that I love about this tool. Let's be fair and talk about the limitations. This is a sticky sheet that you have to apply. As you can see, the sticky is peeling up at the edges, and this will wear out completely at some point and need replaced. I had one incident of the sticky just peeling off entirely with my project, and it's not really easy to make sure that sticky is aligned so that the grid down here, as you can see me putting this paper to align with the grid, make sure that grid on the bottom is aligned with the grid at the lid. It's hard to do that. And here you can see me putting my paper and trying to get an exact centered stamp. And if you're trying to do that, you need a ruler and markings. And so that is imperfect if you want it to be exactly centered. These sheets are not super expensive. However, like I said, they do need replaced, and that is an expense that will come up over time. How long they last, I don't know. I've used one since playing with this tool, and it didn't seem like it lasted all that long to me, but the jury is still out on that issue. This next point will be less common for people in that it's not really recommended for these rubber stamps because, as you'll see, the alignment can be off. It touches the paper at the top before the bottom, and when you squish it down, it causes bowing, and that can warp your image. I haven't had very many problems with that. The company does not recommend it for these stamps. But I do have a few of these larger stamps, and keep in mind, the bigger your stamp is, the more this will be a problem. The smaller your stamp is, like a small sentiment, less of an issue it will be. But I do use these in this platform, and it's working okay for me. All right, we've talked a lot about the basics of these tools and how they can just help you get better stamping, but there are also techniques that these tools can help you accomplish to have more interesting stamping. One of the biggest techniques is repeat stamping. You can see here I'm doing this in the Misti, where I've stamped one image, I've shifted it, used that grid to kind of help me figure out how much I need to shift it over, and then I can go ahead, without moving my stamp, go ahead and repeat that stamp in a next position. And if I need to overstamp it to get a crisper image, I can do that until I'm happy with it. And I just keep going down the page until I get to the end of the paper. And here's where it can get a little awkward, but repeat stamping is a big technique for these tools. You could do the exact same thing with the Sizzix tool. It does have one additional way to do repeat stamping in that the lid can move over into these notches. Those are very predetermined sizes, so it may not be the spacing you want for your stamping, but it is an option and it's there. I tend to kind of keep track of how wide my stamp is grid line wise, and then I will just count down and move that over that many grid lines. So I did that imperfectly here in estimating how many grid lines, and my stamps did overlap a bit, but you could use that as a purposeful technique as well. While we're talking about repeat stamping, we should talk about repeating in a grid, and I find that much easier with the Sizzix tool, and that is why I'm using this largely for my scrapbooking. So here we go. I'm doing a better job at kind of counting how many marks I want to space out these words. I'm just inking up part of my stamp because I can see through that lid. I can do that. And I've got a row of repeating stamping going from the top to the bottom of the page. Now I'm going to mark my paper with a little tick mark of pencil, which I can erase later so that I get even spacing how I want it going the other way. And then I'm going to start stamping across the page as well. And I will just keep moving my paper and making my tick marks so that everything stays even. And then I can come in and fill in a grid of stamping. So here you see I'm going down the page on this column, but I could do the entire paper this way just about. And I say just about because if you place your stamp in the wrong spot, your paper, especially 12 by 12s, may not fit all the way. So you're going to need to place your stamp at the very bottom of this platform in order to do an entire 12 by 12 layout. In fact, I am going to do an entire 12 by 12. I am going to be using that rubber, the red rubber large stamp that I was using earlier. And this makes stamping an entire background easy because these larger stamps are about 6 by 6. But as you can see here, once I do this second set of stamping, there is a little gap on the end. I try filling in that little gap, and as I show you closer, there's still a disconnect between the stamps. Depending on what kind of stamp image you're working with, that may not be a big deal. However, we can combine the idea of the very first stamp tool with its little platform that you stamp on for alignment and do a hack with this tool. So I have a piece of trash plastic packaging. I'm going to tape that firmly in place so it does not wiggle on me. Then I can stamp onto that plastic, and now I can see exactly where this stamp will stamp. If I kind of move that plastic out of the way without undoing that tape, I can align my paper underneath it to where I believe it will stamp the best. And now I can just move that packaging out of the way because the next stamping that I do won't be in the same alignment, and I'll have to redo that step. But here we go with getting this alignment down. And then I have the third quadrant of my entire background done. Since the fourth quadrant is exactly the same, we will go ahead and move on to another technique, which is multicolor stamping. You can do this with any stamp. So I put some tape marks on there to show me where I want to keep my color zones. I ink up one zone, and I'm going to go in rainbow order. So my first zone is going to be red, and I go ahead and stamp that. And then I want to add more red to just the very top of that because the bottom is going to overlap with the next color, which is yellow. And where the yellow and the red overlap, I will get orange, and that is going to create a rainbow stamp. Now you can do this with all the same tones and create more of an ombre look, but I like rainbow, so we're going to do rainbow. So just leave your stamp exactly where it is, clean it off, and then you can re-ink the stamp for the next color. All right, so here is what it looks like after I do that second layer of stamping. And you can see where I've got some orange going on. Okay, I messed up the third layer stamping with the blue, but I redid the whole idea here with the word hello, and you can actually see it a lot better that way anyway. So that's one other fun technique. Now, let's focus on this add-on to the Sizzix platform, but I need to pause you here so that we can discuss it. This is called the Stamp and Spin accessory tool, which goes with the Stamp and Stencil platform tool. You need both to do this job. Together, the cost of these currently is about $100, which is similar in price to the larger Misti tool. However, this has the addition of this spin feature, so you're getting more for the same amount of money. There is another stamping platform on the market by Altenew that has this spin function. However, even with their newest release of this tool, it is still not large enough to fit 12 by 12 papers. So in my opinion, the Sizzix Stamp and Spin tool is still the best bang for the buck for a scrapbooking, stamping world of creativity. All right, let's give this wheel a spin. In the center of the wheel is a screw, and that is the center point of rotation for this. So I am lining up a single stamp near the edge of that center. I'm going to mark on my wheel with a piece of tape and an arrow which way I need to turn. Once you start using this, you'll get used to it, But if you're new to the wheel, this can be a helpful tip so that you keep spinning in the same direction. It doesn't matter which direction, just pick one and go with it. And even if you forget to spin it, it's going to restamp over the exact same spot that you'd stamped before. So it'll just make that image darker. All right, I can spin this wheel in multiple ways. It does have positions where it clicks in place. And so for this particular pattern, I am doing 2 clicks of the wheel, which is a full quarter turn of the wheel. So I took that stamp off and I positioned it into an open gap of the image, which I'm doing again here, to kind of spread this image out. And we're going to create our own pattern paper. Now, you can do this with multiple stamps at a time. If you're new to the process, I would suggest starting with one stamp and building a bit of a pattern and then filling in the gaps until you kind of get used to how the spacing on this wheel works. And I will get to that in a minute. So I have just repeated this entire process multiple times with different stamps and different colors. All right, here is where you can design this from the start. The wheel does have etched marks on it, but I put tape on there to kind of show you where those marks are. You can place as many stamps as you want within that wedge zone, and as you turn the wheel, you will never accidentally overstamp anything that you've previously stamped, and you'll get this wedge pattern repeating all the way around. Now, I'm not quite doing that. I am filling in the gaps of my previous pattern, but the concept is exactly the same. Now, the limit of this is the size of that wheel. You can see one of my little stamps is hanging off the edge. I find that if I have just a little bit hanging off the edge, I can still get that stamped impression just fine, but that is the limit. I can't go any farther than that. And then you end up with this pattern. Depending on how you align your stamps, it may be more circular or more random. So let's go ahead and take a look at a more circular shape. I pulled out all brand new stamps and I have created a bit of a wreath. There are lots of different ways to make wreaths. This is just one idea. That's what I showed you earlier where my sticky grid stuck to my project. I'm just going to peel it off and reapply it to the base. So I used a border stamp and I was able to curve it around the edge of my wreath and make more of a solid circle. And then I filled in just a wedge, which also has grid lines on the spin tool, of other stamps in that quarter section and made my own wreath. Going back a moment here, you see that my that border didn't quite align because that's me learning how to use those grid lines to get things to line up properly. I adjusted it and the next rotation lines up much better. All right, that ends the basics of using this tool. I wanted to add this next section for anyone who's a fan of Concord and Ninth turnabout stamps. This probably won't apply to many of you, so if not, thank you for watching up to this point. But if you want to see what these stamps can do, stick around. These are called turnabout stamps, and like we did on our grid where we designed patterns of stamps, this is a stamp that is pre-designed that way. It's used in the Misti and you rotate the paper. However, we can put this in our stamp wheel and rotate the stamp and we'll get the same effect. So it takes a little bit different usage than in the Misti. You have a template here, this pre-printed plastic sheet that you want to align in the center of your grid. And then you're going to close your lid, lift your stamp, and then remove that plastic sheet. Before you do that, make sure the X of your sheet is aligned with the screw in the center of the wheel, and you'll get this stamp to work. So the basics of using these turnabouts is you go ahead and place your paper in your tool. On the Misti, that would be the corner of your tool. Here, I had to mark my corner in pencil using that template that we started off with. You're going to stamp one impression, and then you're going to rotate, typically the paper, 90 degrees, and then stamp your second impression. But here, we'll rotate our wheel. So I'm going to stamp my first impression, and then I will clean off my stamp, put it back in the wheel, re-ink it with a second color. See, I just made that rotation of a quarter of a turn. Re-ink it with a second color, and then stamp your second impression. And you can do this up to 4 times. And here is what it looks like with those 4 times. Now that does 1/4 of a scrapbook page. You can rotate your page and keep going this same way, but I have a shortcut. Most turnabout stamps create a 6x6 pattern. Here what I'm doing is saving myself some time. Instead of doing one entire 6x6 piece, I am stamping my first impression, rotating my paper, stamping again, doing all 4 corners like that. Then I rotate my stamp to the second position and do the second color the same way. So there's lots of rotating going on here, both with the wheel and with the paper. But this is one way to get a full background pattern paper on a 12 by 12 layout using these turnabout stamps. All right, that wraps up this video. I know it's a long one. It's kind of jam-packed, and I went quickly through multiple things. If you have any questions or want more detail on any of the things I've done here, drop me a note, and I'd be happy to work on slower, more detailed instructions if you need that. All right, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I hope you have an artful day.